Awesome. Okay, so I would like to hand over to Dr. Go now for his presentation. And we invite you to let us know if you have any issues seeing his set of slides, which he's just put up. So I'd love a thumbs up from everyone about if they can see the slides. Actually, can't see any faces. Or, oh yeah, there you go. Awesome. Thanks, Margot. Awesome. Has anyone not been able to see the slides? Okay. Johann, I'm going to hand to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Michelle. Hello, everyone, and thanks very much for joining us for the session. So Michelle's talked a little bit about the broader V&Z research portfolio, which I'll also be covering as the talk unfolds. But the main purpose of this talk today is to share some of the latest updates from Stats New Zealand on volunteering. And the aim is just to give a brief snapshot of the data and then to hopefully leave a bit of time for questions and answers about some of the latest data sets that Stats has released. So this is really fresh off the press. So it was released on the 26th of March, 2025. So this is, it's less than 2 months old. Um, and it draws on data from the 2023 General Social Survey. So it's really the most comprehensive data we have that's regularly produced by Stats New Zealand. It's done through a very large, and it involves a scale that basically none of us in the sector alone can reproduce. So for us, it's really important that this data is available. And just to give a bit of context, VNZ was involved in obtaining this data. So I basically lobbied Stats New Zealand to try and release these insights and to tell us basically how important it was to have these information to hand. These spreadsheets are now available to the public as well. So that was part of the condition for the release. And you can find that under the General Social Survey, what's called the Wellbeing Statistics Update of March 25. So all the spreadsheets, all the data sets are also available on the Stats New Zealand website as part of um, helping, helping the sector have access to these statistics. At the same time, we know that these stats only tell part of the story about volunteering. And so a lot of the research my team and I do at VNZ is to look beyond the pure numerical stats and to understand some of the stories behind these figures. And so we will often do what's called mixed methods research. We want to understand why is it that these patterns exist? How is it that the sector can respond to these patterns? And how we basically complement these existing research by Stats New Zealand is we run our own focus groups, we run our own literature reviews, and we incorporate a lot of these insights into our state of volunteering reports. And so I think it's important to say that these stats insights are highly valuable, but they're only one side of the story, and that it complements rather than replaces the sort of broader research portfolio that VNZ does. But I'm happy to start with some of the initial overview of some general stats around volunteering. So over half of New Zealanders volunteer, so that's about 53.0% with the figures. So over half of New Zealanders, sorry, volunteered in the previous 4 weeks. And this is an increase of 2.3% from the previous period, the exact same sort of survey questions that were asked in 2021 when the rate was 50.7%. And again, these are all highly rigorous and robust population level statistics based on data from a very large data set and sample size from Stats New Zealand. So we can be pretty confident around these figures. So when we look at those people who volunteered, 27.6% volunteered through an organization. So these are frequently what people call formal volunteering. The figure was 30.2% in 2021, so this is a decrease in terms of formal volunteering. 40.8% of volunteers basically volunteered directly, for another person, what's sometimes called informal volunteering. And the figure for informal volunteering was 36% in 2021. So what we find really is that there is an increase in the rates of informal or direct volunteering and a slight decrease in sort of formal or organizational volunteering. When we look at the number of hours that volunteers are providing, Stats produces the following, StatsNZ give us the following figures. So the average hours that the average volunteer commits to their time over the previous 4 weeks is 18.1 hours. And this again is an increase from the previous reporting period. So it's approximately, it's over 2 hours, 2.2 hours to be precise, compared to the 2021 figures. And back in 2021, the average hours volunteered over the previous 4 weeks was 15.9 hours. And so here we see an increase of 2.2 hours compared to the previous reporting period. So when we look at the average number of hours people are volunteering, we can see that it's gone up even more as well. So this is not just formal volunteering, but all aspects of volunteering. It's by about 4.6 compared to data from further back from 2016. So when we look at the sort of information, we find that on average, volunteering has increased by 1 hour per week. Per year compared to 2016. So this shows a kind of upward trend of people giving more of their time and more of their commitment, basically, to these organizations as well as through direct means. There's also interesting figures that Stats New Zealand releases around the gender of volunteers and the kind of image of what a volunteer looks like. So 55.9% of women volunteer, and exactly half of men volunteer. So this, though, is an increase in volunteering participation for both men and women, again, compared to the previous survey in 2021. So in that previous figure in 2021, 53.7% of women volunteered and 47.5% of men volunteered. And what we're finding here now is that it's exactly half of men who volunteer and 55.9% of women volunteer. And it's usually been the case that women have higher rates of volunteering. And we also know anecdotally that they're much more represented in the community and voluntary sector than men, both in the paid capacity as well as in the volunteer management area. We can also look at the breakdown of how many hours volunteers contribute as a percentage. So what I want to point out here is that the most common amount of volunteering, if you'll see on the top row, is that 32.5% of volunteers commit fewer than 5 hours every 4 weeks. And that is the most kind of common amount of volunteering to do, with just under a third of people committing this hour, right? So people do small chunks, fewer than 5 hours, every 4 weeks. And that's the kind of prevailing model on this view. There's also a large chunk you'll find who give quite a lot of hours, who 20.3% of volunteers give 25 hours or more. But what's striking about this figure is many of you will have heard of the term the civic core. So this is this idea that what's sometimes called the 80-20 rule. There used to be a view that 80% of all volunteering work and hours are performed by 20% of the population, or sometimes called the 90-10 rule. 90% of the work being done by 10% of volunteers. But what we find here is that this model is increasingly being challenged. So if you look at the first two columns, that constitutes now more than 50%, more than half of all volunteers. In other words, over half of volunteers are now giving, much fewer hours, but there's a lot more of them as a distribution compared to those who are called the civic core, who give a lot of hours but are very few in number. So we're seeing really a kind of increase in the distribution of volunteering hours and volunteering commitment across a wider group of volunteers who might give a few hours here and there, rather than giving 25 hours a month, for example. And so it's this changing civic core, as we called it, in the State of Volunteering report of the most previous iteration. And we're pretty confident that this trend is going to continue for various reasons. Um, and also confirms that a lot of the research that VNZ is doing really has captured this change in civic core. When the large sample size, Stats New Zealand surveys have pointed out this exact same pattern. We can also look at the percentage of volunteers by the type of organization they volunteer and work with. So the most common type of volunteer, and this has been the case for a few years and also in the last iteration, is the second column there, which is sports or recreation. So these are people who volunteer at sports events, who help with school coaching, sports teams. And about 32.3% of all volunteers who do formal volunteering volunteer in this capacity, volunteering for a sports or recreational organization. What's interesting is if you look at health, at 9.5% of volunteers working in the space, that's comparatively low to what a lot of people might think. So we saw the spike a little bit during COVID, when health had a renewed kind of focus. People were calling out for volunteers in the health sector. But after COVID, we've noticed that this area of volunteering has also gone down. Um, so excluding the other category at the bottom there, health is the least popular type of organization for volunteers to commit their time to. And there are lots of reasons why that might be the case. It could also be because it requires a lot more skill, for example. And so most people who work in the health space are paid rather than volunteers. They're paid professionals. And that explains possibly aspects of why that is the case. Religious and spiritual types of volunteering, is the second highest. So that's 26.3% of volunteers volunteer in this type of organization. Um, and this, in a way, is the hardest to measure because it's not clear what some people consider part of their sort of personal worship, alongside compared to, for example, doing volunteering work for the sake of others, especially when these two are intertwined. So if we were to summarize these, we can see, that the most common types of organizations people volunteer with are sports and recreation. And the second most common is religious or spiritual related volunteering. So 32.3% of volunteers are involved in sports or recreation, and 26.3 are involved in religious or spiritual volunteering organizations. The least common types of organization I mentioned, if we remove the other category, is health, and also arts and culture. 9.5% of volunteers are involved in health, and 10.5% are involved in arts or cultural organizations. When we look at the barriers, so here is a table again that shows the percentage of volunteers who have identified these particular barriers as reasons why they don't volunteer for an organization. So these are barriers to formal volunteering, why they don't volunteer for an organization. If you look towards the middle column there, the middle row, 46.1%, which is the largest percentage of people, say that the main barrier, one barrier to why they don't volunteer, is that they don't have time. And this, again, aligns with a lot of what we're hearing, which is that people are much more time poor. What's also interesting is if we look at the second row down, sorry, 16.3% of people say that a barrier to volunteering is that nobody has asked them to volunteer. And this goes back again to some of the best practice guidelines, some of the general principles of volunteering management around being proactive and making it easy to volunteer and asking people, not just assuming that they will come to you, but also encouraging people to volunteer and approach your organization. Other interesting aspects from this, when we look at the top row, so some people say that there are no barriers 12.4% of people say there are no barriers to volunteering, they just don't do it. And again, this has been a pretty constant figure. Some people just are not into volunteering for all kinds of different purposes. But many people say, yeah, there are no barriers. I'm just not in the mood for volunteering, or perhaps there are other reasons that are not captured by by the other options that are provided here. We can see a similar kind of insight when we look at direct volunteering or informal volunteering. So here are volunteers and the barriers they experience, or people who don't volunteer, the barriers they experience, um, and why they don't do informal or direct volunteering. If you look at the most common reason, which is the don't have time category around the middle row again, 41.3% of people identify this as an option. And notice that this is much less, or a little bit less, than the ones who say that time is a barrier to formal volunteering. And partly that makes sense because if you do direct or informal volunteering, you have a little bit more liberty about how much time you give and how much you'll do. There are also more people, 18.0%, who say there are no barriers to direct or informal volunteering. They just don't do it for one reason or the other. And we can see on the second row down that not being asked is another big reason why people find it a barrier to undertake direct volunteering. So 23.4% of people say that they don't volunteer directly because nobody has asked them to. One thing just to highlight about these two previous graphs is because they are talking about barriers to volunteering, it's very hard to get this kind of data through the sector. Um, because by definition, you're asking people who don't volunteer why they don't volunteer. The kinds of people we deal with in general are those who are already volunteers. And so there's a lot of challenge actually in finding out these insights. So the fact in particular that these two slides can be made available through population level sampling and in a way that allows Stats New Zealand to approach people who don't volunteer and to ask them why they don't volunteer. That's a very valuable insight that is not readily available for us as a sector. Um, that is not very easy for us as a sector to obtain. So to summarize, the most common barrier to volunteering is time. 46.1% of people identify it as a barrier to formal volunteering. 41.3% of people say that this is a barrier to direct or informal volunteering, while 23.4% of people say they don't undertake direct or informal volunteering because nobody has asked them to. And the figure is 16.3% of people when it comes to formal volunteering with an organization. There's also some interesting insights around ethnicity and volunteering. So European people are most likely to volunteer out of all ethnic groups, according to STATS data. So 55.2% of Europeans volunteer. Maori are at 54.5, Pacific peoples at 52.3, and Asian, who are least likely, at 42.2. But one thing we always say about a lot of the stats around ethnicity and volunteering is that there are different conceptions cross-culturally around what counts as volunteering. Um, and part of VNZ's work is to help conceptualize a little bit further about what it actually means to volunteer, and whether some groups are more or less likely to consider something counting as a volunteer work or not. So, to take the Pacific Peoples example, when we looked at the measure and definition of volunteering that's used by the Ministry for Pacific Peoples, the rate is much, much higher than the ones used by Stats New Zealand. When we look at Asian volunteers and what they consider volunteering and not volunteering, if they were to help out a neighbor, they would not count that as volunteering because they see that as part of the community ethos. Whereas when we ask Europeans, they would consider that part of direct volunteering. And so these are just some sort of considerations when we're looking at how we conceptualize volunteering across cross-cultural and different sort of ethnic groups that these figures require further interrogation. We can also look at age. So the age group with the highest rates of volunteering are those aged 45 to 64. And so 59.3% of people in this age group volunteer either directly or through an organization. And 54.1% of people aged 65 and above volunteer. Um, so there's a common view that it's the people who are 65 and over who are retired who are carrying out the majority of volunteering. But actually, when we look at the population level data, that's not the case. It's much more common for working age people to be volunteering than those who are retired. We can also look at whether having LGBT identity makes you more or less likely to volunteer and the kinds of barriers people face. So we know that 3.1% of LGBT volunteers don't volunteer because they were dissatisfied with the previous volunteer experience. Um, and that may not sound like a lot, but the same figure for this rate is 1.0% for the total population. So it's over three times more likely for an LGBT volunteer to not volunteer because they were dissatisfied with the previous volunteer experience. And that might have implications around how we think about inclusion and equity and best practice guidelines for involving a broader group of volunteers. 14.9% of LGBT volunteers don't volunteer because they don't know how to get involved. So that should say, LGBT people don't volunteer because they don't know how to get involved. And again, the total population figure is about 8.1% for the total population. And so again, this shows some of the demographic differences and the ways that these stats help us highlight where we could do better and where we can find important opportunities to promote more inclusion. The same also applies to stats around disability and volunteering. So we know that from the stats, people with disabilities are much less likely to volunteer. So we know that 45.9% of disabled people volunteer, compared to 53.8% of non-disabled people. So this is not just the total population, but the population who are not disabled. And that's why it's slightly higher than the population average. And so here is a slight difference that we notice here. But that difference in statistical terms is quite significant, showing possibly some of the barriers that still exist here. What's interesting, though, is that disabled people who volunteer perform more volunteering hours than non-disabled people. So a disabled volunteer on average contributes 25.4 hours every 4 weeks, compared to non-disabled people who contribute 19.8 hours every 4 weeks. And this is also higher than the total population average of 20.3 hours every 4 weeks. So in other words, even though as a percentage, maybe we can see less engagement amongst disabled people, those who are engaged are already much more committed and very committed to the volunteering um, to the volunteering cause. Stats New Zealand's also provided a breakdown of the number of percentage of volunteers, of people who volunteer, depending on which region of the census they belong to. So remember that the total population rate for volunteering is 53.0%. So 53.0% of New Zealanders as a whole volunteer. But we can see how this breaks down by region. So 59.1% of Northlanders volunteer, so that's above the national average. 48.0% of Aucklanders volunteer, so that's below the national average. In Waikato, it's 54.3%, again above the national average. In the Bay of Plenty, it's 51.8%. In Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, it's 50.9%. In Taranaki, which is the highest rate in New Zealand, it's 67.7% of the population volunteer. In Manawatu, Whanganui, which is the lowest in the country, 45.7% of people volunteer. In Wellington, it's quite high at 63.5. The Nelson, Tasman, Marlborough, and West Coast area, it's at 61.8%. In Canterbury, it's 52.3%. In Otago, it's 50.5%, again, a little bit below the national average. In Southland, it's 64.7%, also above the national average. So these are we can be pretty confident on the statistical data and the analysis that's gone into this by Stats New Zealand. So it gives us a pretty good indication of some of the regional variations in volunteering. Now, of course, it doesn't give us reasons why. So some of the work that the VNZ is doing is understanding, for example, why particular areas have higher or lower rates of volunteering, and to look at why these might be the case and particular reasons why um, people might be less likely to volunteer and what we can do about that. In terms of some of the, this is just a very brief word cloud of some of the words that constantly come up in some of these surveys that we've done and some of the thematic analysis that we're doing. Um, and it's just to say that a lot of these themes are reflected in the Stats New Zealand survey, and which will form a key part of our 10-year report going forwards. But I'll end there for now. I'll leave my emails and contact details on the screen. Um, and of course, you're very welcome to send me an email, and I'll be very happy to discuss further about any aspects of the discussion covered. And as I said, all this information is available on the Stats New Zealand website, partly due to VNZ's work. And you can find that under the Wellbeing Statistics Update of 2025. So I'll hand over back to Michelle.
Awesome. Thanks, Johan. We will obviously send out links to the data sources that Johan mentioned. But uh, what I'd love to do now is two things: is open up to the room for an opportunity to ask you questions while we have you here, and to also maybe invite you just before that happens. To share anything that you might want to specifically share around the 10-year review report. It might be useful to people. And in the while we're uh, please start putting some questions in the chat or put your hand up if you have a question for Johan, and we'll work through those. Yeah. Johan, do you want to just quickly talk about our 2026 report?
Sure. So basically, Volunteering New Zealand has been publishing the States of Volunteering report in various forms for the past 10 years, basically. And I think there's an interesting opportunity to look back over the past 10 years and see where volunteering has how far we've progressed, the kind of trends over a 10-year period. Because obviously looking at trends in an annual or biennial basis is really interesting, but it's also interesting to look at it over a 10-year horizon. Um, and the aim is that over a 10-year horizon, we can see the general patterns. We can also see the kinds of threats that might come in the future, the kinds of opportunities or threats that we have to be aware of going forward. And that's really the rationale for that. But as also stakeholders in the sector, for everyone here, if there's anything that you particularly want to see in the report or you particularly want us to think about going forward, then please feel free to reach out to me as well or to mention it here because we want the report to be useful to the sector. So we produce a lot of research, we liaise with a lot of agencies, and part of what we want to do is to be strategic and try and make sure that we're producing information that is that can be used for the sector for advocacy, for policy making, as well as to inform volunteering best practice and policy as well.
Thank you, Johan. We do have our first question, which is from Katrina Brown. Nelson, Tasman, Marlborough, West Coast is a massively diverse region. Is there a way to get West Coast data separately through those spreadsheets?
Yeah. So the short answer is no, because these are the groupings that Stats New Zealand use to divide the places. And part of why they do that is that it's to do with population density. Sometimes there aren't enough respondents or enough people to basically divide it further into by region. But what we do know is that Stats will adjust the data. It's called weighting. So a bit like when you see a poll on one news or news hub, it's been weighted, and that means that they adjust for age, for population, for particular social factors, so that the sample that they have from that region should represent the average person across the entire region. I agree that it means that you can't have Nelson-specific data or West Coast-specific data, but that's the way Stats currently does it, and we don't have the resources at the moment to basically survey just the West Coast because that's not how the current division in the data is done. Yeah.
I would just mention also that we appreciate that regional data is really important to people across the motu, and we did, as part of our SOV, produce a sub-report on regionalism and volunteering. So one of my team will drop that in the link. We've got a couple more questions, but that's a good report to reference back to. So one from Margot in Hawke's Bay, the chair of Volunteering Hawke's Bay, is interested to know the ethnicity contribution to StatsNZ data capture of percentage of population that the emoji is in my way that are volunteering in Gisborne, Hawke's Bay. Is that available anywhere? I hope I just read that out right, but there was a little emoji in my way.
Right, I see it in the chat. Yeah, so it's a good question, Margot, but basically, again, the short answer is no, because stats don't do that level of analysis. So to give you one other example, you can, in theory, look at for example, to give one example, what are the barriers experienced by transgender volunteers in the health sector? But if you look on the spreadsheet, there is the word S on that, which means suppressed. And the reason they do that is because if the details, if the respondents drop below a certain demographic, to run the risk of not being identified, they basically will not publish that data. Now, because there aren't that many transgender volunteers in the West Coast who face barriers in the social sector, to give one example, that's four different axes. They will suppress that data for confidentiality reasons. And because of the ethnicity breakdown by some regions, that might be the case. Um, so that could be the case for the Hawke's Bay and Gisborne, I'm not sure. But in general, they won't give highly specific data to the public in that raw form. And that's partly for data protection and confidentiality. Um, I, if we were to look more, we do look at ethnicity by focus groups. So I think some of VNZ's work, we look at a bit more closely around the experiences of minority ethnic groups. But that's more of a kind of focus group type qualitative insight rather than a representative stats insight. So I'm afraid the answer is we probably don't have the ethnicity breakdown by region to that degree. Um, the sector probably wouldn't have the capacity to do that, and Stats New Zealand don't currently release that level of detail.
Johann, another question, which we may be offline answer, but do you have international volunteering statistics as a comparison with NZ volunteering?
Sure. So not immediately to hand, but I can point you to some. So if you look at, for example, IAVE, the International Association for Volunteer Effort, they compile a lot of resources and summarize some of the general sort of perspectives in the world. The UK has something called NCVO, the National Center for Voluntary, also the National Center for Voluntary Organizations, and they compile a lot of international data. They have a full-time, I mean, they're a very big organization, so they have research capacities, in the order of 50 times more than we do at BNZ, and that in a way gives them a lot of personnel to go and do these research. I don't have the figures to hand, but in general, the New Zealand rate of 53.6% of 53.0% of people volunteering. That's broadly in line with international metrics. Um, Again, adjusting for the fact that people measured volunteering differently and conceptualized it differently as well across cultures.
Thank you, Johann. There's definitely some great reports published by IRV about, I guess, the state of the world, volunteering in the state of the world, and that's always a really interesting um, source data to have a look at. It'll be thematic and, I guess, based on other research, not necessarily population data comparison, probably is less able to be achieved. Um, so, um, Kate, do you have a question? I'm just reading. Do you have a specific question? that you'd like to share, or just sharing back, reflecting back, sorry.
Sorry, I realised that was perhaps a statement, and I was in the middle of writing my question. Perhaps I can verbalise it. Yeah, so I guess obviously we're not the only ones struggling with resource. Everyone's very aware of that in terms of volunteering. So my question is how can we, as a collective voice, use the stats because they are really insightful. How can we use them to influence government? To really support us to make the most of volunteering and build resilience and community through volunteering.
I might
Sure. I
start
think
the answer to that one, Johan, just quickly. Absolutely. One of the reasons we've done the knocking on StatsNZ for more data is because we know it will help everybody. So one of the things that we've had as a priority is advocating for this data to be made available and more data to be available for the sector to inform decision making. Um, Johann's work leading into the start of next year. Next year is the International Volunteer Year, 2026. The last one happened in 2001, and a lot of advocacy and things progressed during that time, including the formation of Volunteering New Zealand. So it is a big year, and we intend to, with the compilation of the 10-year report and these stats, and also listening and connecting with stakeholders to have an advocacy program for 2026 and also a really comprehensive 10-year report that is useful not just for us in speaking up, but hopefully for all of our members and stakeholders as well. Would you add
no,
anything, Johan?
I think I would echo all that. Basically, the useful thing about some of these snapshots is that it's a way to back up specific points that we have hunches on, but now we have concrete evidence for that. So, if, for example, if you've got a project trying to expand, the volunteering programs to other groups, then you can have these data to back up and say, look, we know that there aren't enough volunteers from these groups, and so we're trying to reach them out. Here's our program. Here's why this program should be supported, and here's the data to back it up from Stats New Zealand showing that the scope for this group to be involved. So on their own, the data doesn't tell the full story. You've got the frame of narrative, but they give you a kind of skeleton by which you can form a narrative. Um, and if you have a look at one of the tabs, you can look at how there's even a tab on whether volunteering is correlated with happiness in life or quality of life, right? So again, you probably can't draw causal inferences, but you might be able to say that there's a link between volunteering and being happy in life or having higher quality of life. And so these are the kinds of sort of insights that are quite good sound bites, and also are quite good for trying to convey, I guess, the value that the sector adds to both the economy, to well-being, and to people's lives more generally.
So, and the report and the yeah, kind of I guess summarizing the opportunity is to uh, use the insights to feed into advocacy and additional insights. There's some things that I was making a note of in terms of LGBT and disability, where there's opportunities for us to do additional stuff in the best practice guidelines to support organisations to um, be inclusive and accessible and aware of issues for those groups. But there's a lot we can do with it. There's a I want to just come to Garth's summary comment is uh, in his reflection is more people volunteering less, flattening of the civic core. And my response is that yes, and less people are doing stuff for formal organizations, and more things are happening in the informal direct space. So it's a real challenge opportunity for organizations to think about when you look at those time giving trends that are coming through to think about how you're shaping your roles, how you're engaging with people, and are we giving volunteers what they are looking for in their volunteering experience? Which, and to Kate's point around resourcing, obviously those are challenges from a resourcing and operational point of view, but something to be very aware of. Um, there is a couple more questions coming through. Uh, this is from Mikisu Hall, and it's what stats are available comparing volunteer numbers to regional need. For instance, rural regional areas can have a greater need for volunteers to transport to services based in metropolitan areas, and rural region areas uh, are, are volunteers more likely to have to cover a variety of services that may be paid roles in larger economies. There's a lot in that question, but I think maybe are there any insights, Johan, from our previous regional report that might be relevant to that question or the
Yeah.
data?
So, I mean, I'll try and answer the question, and perhaps Mukisu can get back to us if they think that it's not quite what they were asking. So as I understand it, you're asking whether there are ways you can compare volunteer numbers to actual need. So for example, Auckland might have fewer volunteers because there are more paid services. Maybe there are fewer services in rural areas, and so you need higher volunteers. Um, Again, the short answer is no, because how you measure need is very, very difficult. It's not just a volunteering issue. If you look at even something like health need, how you measure health need is very complex, even for the government who do this as a day-to-day job. Um, from what we found in our stats in our regional insights report, you're right that there's kind of more volunteers who work in rural areas tend to have to travel more, and so it you can't be as efficient, for example, in discharging help. I think that's what your question was alluding to. If you're a volunteer in a town centre, a lot of people can come to you and access your services. In a large rural area, say like Tairāwhiti, it's much harder to get everyone to come to one location. You might have to travel around with your organization. You might have to distribute various things. But there's no current way to measure whether current volunteer percentages correspond to need. That level of analysis again isn't something that's being done by anyone I know of at the moment. But it is a good question in terms of how we match volunteer need, sorry, how we match volunteer supply, if you want to call it, with the kind of demand for these needs.
Anyone have any additional questions? Actually, Garth has asked something which I think we probably don't know the answer to, but I'm just going to put it out there. Is there any way to track if the two shifts are generational from volunteering for organisation to informal volunteering, and more people each volunteering less? Could we hypothesize that post-millennials more likely to volunteer for causes than organisations and for specific activities than forever? If this is the case, these shifts are only likely to accelerate into the future. I think we're always going to see evolving shifts in how people want to show up and volunteer. So we have to always be shifting and thinking about what people want um, as for the volunteer experience, and that is at the heart of the best practice guidelines. Uh, Johanna, what would you say from a
Yeah,
statistics
so
point of
I
view?
think just to add to that, I don't think the stats that were released by Stats New Zealand add anything specifically to this question. But I think these reflect some of what we hear from people in our youth focus group, for example, and from our State of Volunteer report, particularly in the 2022 edition. And what we found in that report is young people saying that they prefer to volunteer for causes that they feel passionate about, rather than to just do what we might call the legacy volunteering style. So they cared more about environmental causes, for example, and social justice causes, rather than, for example, volunteering with a well-known household name charity. For them, it was more about the cause that mattered. But they still also cared about an organization in the sense that what they were volunteering for isn't just a cause, but an organization that championed their cause. So a lot of young volunteers still want structure. They want a kind of formality. It's just that how they choose their organization is more driven by their cause and their principles. I think what Garth is saying around this kind of idea of the cause is correct. I think you also mentioned a little bit about volunteering forever or this kind of time frame. We did see in the regional data report as well around retention rates. Again, this is not captured in the stats data, but we do know that younger people tend to have higher turnover rates and lower retention rates. Part of the reason is that a lot of young people are at school and university, and so when they move, they tend to not be there for as long. And so I think it's we can't interpret this as saying that they're not as committed. A lot of it could just be that they are also volunteering for a shorter amount of time because they're part of their it's part of their transient student lifestyle for that time being.
May I just add, and I was like writing notes, and you may have mentioned this, but I think it's really important when we're talking about younger generations and volunteering to point out that actually there's a kind of uh, a narrative about young people not wanting to show up and not wanting to volunteer, but the stats don't lie. In terms of that participation rate, was quite high for young people between 16 to 24, isn't it, Johan?
Mhm. Yeah, no, again, when we look at we can see this broken down by age range, and again, you can see it by different life stages. These are all quite. What I mean, sorry, is that it's not as disparate as some of people might have you believe. It's not that young people are not volunteering, or the old people are volunteering. It's much more nuanced than that. And again, we see this in the population level stats that have been passed. And then Kate just posted that they've had 255 rangatahi sign up for a Volunteer Careers Expo. So, these anecdotal stories do kind of support this general view.
Absolutely. Kate.
So, Kate has also asked another question around the volunteering impact and sort of opportunity cost and cost. I mean, so Heidi just shared something as well, but one thing that, again, this is something Volunteering New Zealand is publicizing. One very crude way is to take the total volunteering hours that have been committed last year, and we can share these figures, and multiply that by either the living wage or the minimum wage. And you'll find that it comes to several million, if not nearly a billion, right? And that gives you a very, very crude economic value of the volunteering hours if they were paid minimum wage or the living wage. That's not perfect. I think volunteering is worth more than that. But it nevertheless captures an aspect of what we're trying to say, that there is a monetary value to volunteering that we can at least capture when we look at how many hours are being committed to these causes. Um, and again,
I think
from one very simple example, if you look at especially organizations that have mixed paid volunteer staff, St. John Ambulance, for example, Fire and Emergency, you can work out really, because if these volunteers aren't there, you would be hiring paid staff to do that position. So again, that's one very simple way you can show that actually there is a huge economic benefit to volunteering. You don't want to say it's purely that, but if you were trying to convince people about the value, that you could point towards these kinds of narratives to try and show that there is an economic benefit that's quite tangible actually, and the way to measure it. Yeah.
it's a great question, Kate, and I guess that's part of uh, deep in the ingrained in the kind of things we are trying to do here at Volunteering New Zealand with a very small team. One thing I would note is that in response to the sort of emergent social investment landscape space, that Inspiring Communities is working on some really basic tools for organisations to simply share impact and value and show yeah, it's worth looking at them when they come out. Um, we've recently produced a basic theory of change document, which provides framework for benefits and outcomes and investing in volunteer management and leadership. I think there's work to do at all levels, and we can continue this korero offline collectively, but it's something that we might want to pick up on the 10-year report. But it's a mix of shifting organisations themselves as well as external funders. But I think if we're not if we're not surfacing it in our budgets and in our operations and understanding that to have volunteers uh, enabling our purpose and kaupapa, then they may not continue. And actually, I think the stats show in my view, actually signal we need to invest more into volunteering infrastructure within organisations because we need to change up the offerings and experiences and adapt. And the more we want to structure volunteering opportunities around emergent changes in populations, we're actually it's going to take more time and more leadership and more infrastructure. And yeah, there's a lot to say here. So I'm happy to continue the korero later. Oh, I better go back to the, is there anything they wanted to say in response to any of that, Kate, though, while I check the questions?
No, thanks for that. Yeah, it's just I think perhaps it is somewhere that that your organisation could really support people like me too. So, and I don't know how that would be exactly, but even having those conversations, 4 years into this role, I'm still having those conversations and haven't felt like I've got not too far. So if a place like the Salvation Army can really change that thinking around, be supported to do that will make a huge impact in a good chunk of volunteer sector. So yeah, I think that is a great space to invest in.
Yeah, I'm sort of circling around this. Volunteering New Zealand has literally just produced a new strategic plan where, focused work in this area is definitely something we can invest in.
Thanks.
I don't currently see any more questions. I'm just going to open up to the floor. Is there anyone else who has a question? Otherwise, I might ask, Cheryl, you had some really great news to share in terms of resources and your experience. Would you like to share any of that with us? Maybe she's not here anymore.
Absolutely.
Oh,
Yeah, I can't get my video to work, so never mind. You can just imagine. Yes,
just for context, it's Cheryl Martin, who is the long-term General Manager of Volunteering Auckland.
okay, so
Cheryl.
there's a couple of things. We are in the process of completing a new support guide for community organisations who engage volunteers, and this one is specifically to support them in engaging people from the disabled community, whether it's intellectual, physical, or neurodiverse. We're hoping to have that finished within the next couple of months. We also have a support guide completed that supports community organisations in engaging with 14 to 18-year-olds as volunteers, and we also have quite a number of articles on various topics on our website, including how to measure the impact of volunteers and volunteering, and how to establish clear, measurable objectives for a volunteer program, and many others. I do an article once a week, and they're on various topics. So absolutely happy for you to have a look. I keep them very, very practical, no more than 5 minutes. And if you want to discuss them further, give me a ring. There you go.
Thank you, Cheryl. That's awesome. Any further questions? I would note that Johann is dialing in from the other side of the world, so it's coming close to his bedtime. Um, but very welcome to take any last minute questions. And then also, I know we've put this out to 10:30 just in case it ran over. Got to give you back some time, but if anyone wanted to stay on to ask me, Heidi, or Marg any additional questions about anything related to Volunteering New Zealand. Maybe not deep dive on data though, because that's Johann's expertise, and we've had that now, and he'll probably have to go to bed. Is there another question? Oh no, it's just more sharing of information from Cheryl. We'll capture all the links shared and share them back to participants. So don't worry about having to write down all the links. So it looks like, Johann, that we don't have any additional questions. So what I might do is, well, first of all, thank you for your amazing and continued hard work for Volunteering New Zealand and being a key part of our research and championing the access to research and data, and but also bringing the evidence and analytical and thorough research element to it. So we are not, we're not working off assumptions. We're working off evidenced insight. So thank you so much for that. Yeah, so and we can take questions offline to Johann, as we've mentioned, and we'll make his details available in the summary. So for now, what I'll do is I'll close this out with our closing karakia, but absolutely invite anyone who wants to stay on the line to chat with me, Marg, or Heidi about anything to do so. So whetikatia ki runga, whetikatia ki raro, kia tau te aotonga, kia tau te maramatanga, I roto e te pona me te tika, kia tau, kua tau, tūturu whakamaua kia tina, haumia, huia, taikia. And thank you to everyone for showing up today, investing some time and listening to what we had to share. We're really grateful for you coming along, and hopefully it's been a really useful session. I know I learned a lot. Thank you, Johann. So yeah, wishing you all a great day and National Volunteer Week.
For your
And big
questions.
shout out.
Thank you.